And one of the things that he studied is the value of unpredictable perturbations. Now, just as a qualifier, this has mostly been in people returning from injury, but they've got pretty dramatic results. So, for example, a simple drill might look like I'm going to step off a box. And it's not a high box, maybe a 20 centimeter box, it's not very high. And I'm just going to stick the landing. So it's an easy task. And just as I'm stepping off, I get a nudge. Simple as that. I just get a nudge. I get a push. I have a partner behind me and they give me a little push. So that is an unexpected perturbation. I don't hit the ground as I planned. And all these really short loop, really primitive reflexes have to kick in. Boom, boom, boom. And then I stabilize. Another one might be I'm going for a basketball layup and I get nudged again. So again, my landing is thrown off and I have to adjust. And again, the short loop reflexes have to kick in really quickly and correctly. And then the longer loop reflexes kick in and then my conscious control kicks in. Now, that sounds like really simple stuff, but the amazing thing has been, even with international level athletes, the level of improvement that they've gotten in things like short-term speed, jump ability, basic metrics, of coherent, powerful athletic movement.
That was sports scientist and coach John Kiely speaking on the use of perturbation and the dramatic performance effects it can bring about in a training program. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by SimpliFaster. SimpliFaster is an online athletic performance technology shop distributing items such as the Freelap timing system, GymAware, K-Box, 1080 Sprint, and the Speed Mat. I've gotten many of these items from SimpliFaster and can confidently say that they make today's best training technology available to everybody. The Freelap timing system has revolutionized both my practices and my athlete assessments, allowing me to look at the 10-meter fly capability of dozens of athletes in a matter of seconds. It is wireless, compact, portable, and incredibly versatile. The K-Box and 1080 Sprint are fantastic tools for any coach looking to build speed, agility, and implement training scenarios that go beyond the traditional weight room. The 1080 Sprint is being used by great coaches training some of the fastest sprinters in the world, and it truly represents high-performance speed training. I can personally attest that SimpliFaster's customer service is second to none. Christopher at SimpliFaster responds quickly to queries, and anyone who makes a purchase from SimpliFaster is in good hands. If you want to acquire some of the best high-tech training equipment available, stop by SimpliFaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. They are the future of coaching technology. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith. Thanks for being here today, and we have none other than sports scientist and strength coach, John Kiely. John is a senior lecturer at the University of Lancashire, a strength coach with extensive experience in rugby, as well as other sports. He's worked with Olympic-level triple jumpers, for those of you track coaches who are tuning in today, and he's also a former boxing champion. John is definitely one of the most intelligent minds in the field. He's widely known for his ideals in periodization and planning, maybe so much so that you saw John Kiely and you were thinking, all right, periodization, we're going to talk periodization. I love periodization. Organization of training has been something that's just been near and dear to my heart for a long time. I couldn't have been a athlete and coach in my 20s more obsessed with the subject and still love it today. But John's experience and knowledge runs much further than periodization. I've listened to the podcast and episodes he's done on that, and it's just brilliant stuff and definitely has had an impact on my thoughts on the topic. But some of John's work that's really struck a chord with me, that's kind of, I've read it and then have never been able to look the same way at things in terms of athletes and how athletes put together movement, is coordination and running. And I know obviously there's the trend in this podcast, sprinting, jumping, and all these things that are important to being a high level athlete. But the cool thing about coordination training, when you really get into it, is it goes into skills for all sports, any sport you could think of. It's skill acquisition is just critical. And we all know that obviously success in sport runs much deeper than just how high you can jump or how fast you can run. Those things are awesome. But knowing coordination really can it can help improve all facets. And so one of the things that John is going to chat with us about is coordination, variability as well. So how and why is it important to get variability, different, and not training the same exact skill over and over and over again. He draws parallels to the field of music. What happens to the brain when you just do the same skill? And I take that from when I was a high jumper and found out very quickly that if I only practice high jump I got away from basketball and a diversity of jumping and movements. And it was always common in track is you go stale. Like a high jumper will get stale and not jump as high the further they get away from basketball season. Why is that? What's going on? Obviously a lot of things, but what's going on in the brain? And it was really cool to hear John's take on that. I really can never look at diversity of movement the same way again, and I think it's something that's always going to stick with me. On the show, we also get into the concepts or the theory and ideas of how we differed in terms of running from the animals, how we got to where we are now. John is also going to talk about reflexes in sport as well as internal versus external cues, given the rules of coordination and training. And actually, I should expand on that. He's going to give a checklist or basically boxes to check. There we go, boxes to check as you decide if the coordination, if skill acquisition is going to take hold in your program. So if you want athletes to learn a skill, what are the boxes you need to check off to make that happen? And that is gold. And I think you are going to, coming on the back end of this episode, I can't imagine that you won't be able to learn something new in that overview of how you see athletes learning skills, getting better at what they do. So let's get on to the show, episode 113 with John Kiely. John, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here today.
Joel, pleasure to be here. Nice to meet you.
So reading through your writings in the last several years and listening to some of the other podcasts you've done, I know you've done just a ton of really quality work on periodization that's given me some really big things to think about and continue to think about as I go through my programming. But I think it was the original article that got me turned on to your work was some things that you've done with running. And I think it was something with some online runners, well, I can't remember the name, but you were talking about people who had like their no hamstring and could still function or something and run fast still. And I was like, holy cow, like the human body is amazing. So I really wanted to focus on that today and dig into that topic a little bit. And so I guess there's a lot of ways to come at this, but when we compare humans to animals in terms of how we evolved and developed and where we are now, what are we good at and what are we poor at? I think maybe that's a good place to start. And I think a lot of people don't really look at animals, but I certainly like comparing. So what strengths do we have compared to the animal kingdom?
Okay, well, obviously you're talking about in terms of strengths we have in relation to running. And maybe that article you mentioned, just to scroll back to that a little bit, that was something in the Running Times, which is a kind of a coach's wing of Runner's World. I think it's gone out of business now, hopefully not because of that article, but yeah, and it was, they were interested in something on coordination, which is kind of a topic that I've been really interested in for a long time. And the example so there was an American Olympian, Serena Burla, who had, I forget what hamstring muscle it was, but she had most of it removed following a cancer, and qualified for the Olympics after that. Became a 2:20 marathoner, which is kind of the stamp of excellence in female marathon running at the moment. And I added another story there from 1938 Olympics of a runner, Glenn Cunningham, who had most of one of his feet amputated as a kid subsequent to a fire. Now, a fire when he was very young. But he learned to run, and he was a dominant 1,500 meter runner, was favourite for the gold in Berlin, but ended up with a silver, but broke multiple world records over the course of his career. And, things like that kind of fly against the conventional way we teach about or think about running and training in general. We kind of have it. We have a philosophy and a theory that's constructed as if we're trying to train machines, and there's a big distinction between a machine which has one perfect way of operating, software and hardware. This is the way, the only way. Whereas humans, especially when it comes to something like running, we are master adapters. Burla adapting to the loss of or partial loss of a key muscle, for example, and finding a way around it. Cunningham losing a couple of foot arches and finding a way around it. And that's what we do all the time. So that type of, I guess, plasticity is a good thing to call it, because it's dependent on plasticity in the brain, neuroplasticity in the spinal cord, neuroplasticity, and at the level of the tissue as well, just tissue plasticity. And we are really the nature's superstars in just being adaptable. So I guess in relation to your question in how do humans compare to animals as runners, there's a couple of big distinctions, but they're not really distinctions we think about on a regular basis. And I guess the first one is first of all, we're the best endurance runners out there. Horses run us close, and under some circumstances, over some distances, at some temperatures, a well-trained horse will beat a well-trained person. But, you get the right environmental circumstances. If it's hot, if it's humid, humans will beat horses. And it's actually an incredible skill we don't really think of. We are the best endurance runners. I guess the key paper on that was Lieberman and Bramble, Dan Lieberman from Harvard in 2004, published in Nature. Forget the name of it now, but it just went through all the adaptations that we have embedded in us that enable us to just be fantastic runners, and how that was a survival strategy for humans back in prehistoric days, where collections of humans would hunt an animal to heat exhaustion. And it's just a very effective, very safe way of catching your dinner without exposing you to excessive risk. So how are we different on a kind of practical level? Well, first of all, we dissipate heat through our skin. We're hairless and so on, whereas most animals have to slow down to pant, basically. But again, if anyone wants to read more on that, if they read Lieberman's work on persistent hunts, then that'd be a really interesting read for them. The other thing I think we don't think about a lot, but it's quite remarkable, is that if you get a foal or a calf, they're standing after a couple of hours, whereas we're lying on our bellies and our backs, kicking in the air for the first number of months of our life at least. And there's a good reason for that long, prolonged infanthood. And that is, a foal is born with some pretty hardwired reflexes in there, whereas all of ours, we do have reflexes, obviously, and you'll see in a newborn child, they'll scrunch their fingers and they'll open their hand and they'll scrunch their eyes and so on. But ours are a lot less hardwired. Now, that's a problem from one perspective, because we're totally vulnerable for the first few years of our lives. But on the other hand, it's what differentiates us from most animal species, and that is that we can learn to do a wide variety of skills in a wide variety of ways. So, a seal might be able to balance a ball on its nose in a circus, but they can't play the violin, or they can't drive a car, and no other animal comes close to our level of skills. And it's really because of that. We're born pretty much as a blank slate, and then gradually over time we plastically embed movement habits, and we have the space to do it, and we've the developmental time to do it, because we're nurtured throughout our long childhood, and yeah. So I went on too long in that, but bottom line, there's plenty of differences between us and animals. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that we're also the only efficient runners who run on two legs. And running on two legs is very different to running on one leg. It's obviously way more of a stability challenge. And that stability challenge isn't trivial, because if you think about it, the most sensitive, delicate, precious part of our beings are our brains. And our brains are pretty delicate, and yet we've decided to stick them on top of this long pole and then bounce along on one foot when we spend most of the time off the ground. So it seems a pretty crazy evolutionary strategy. But I guess on the other side, what it does is it gives us an evolutionary advantage, whatever that advantage might have been back in days gone by. The ability to see, I don't know, be very efficient, be able to use our hands while we run. Brings me to another distinction between us and the animals, is that we can think pretty clearly when we run. In other words, our brains don't shortcut everything else and push our ability to think carefully out, or it doesn't use up all that spare capacity in our neural system, so we can think while we run, which again, it's hard to judge that with animals, but it's not clear that they can do that as adeptly as we can. Long story short, whole load of adaptations makes us very efficient runners. We are better than the four-legged animals under most circumstances. We can think, we have exceptional balance, but that balance takes a long time to reach its full fruition. But yeah, I guess that's a short question answered in a very long way.
I really appreciated that, actually, because for me, I guess there's the running and training nerd side of me, and then also just a lot of almost like light bulbs that go off in the sense of when we train athletes for performance. I guess not like sports skill performance, I guess you could say. Well, maybe in some ways, but just like raw movement. Like you watch a cheetah run, and you're like, well, who needs to train that cheetah to run? Like a thing could go but what fascinated me particularly is you hear people talk about the human body is very reluctant to adapt. It likes to adapt in the direction of endurance. It's hard to train it to adapt to speed, to being faster is the thing that I think about a lot. And it's interesting in terms of what you were saying, how the human body evolved and how we became different, and how we probably had an advantage in hunting and things like that, working collectively. And so one of the things that you said, actually, it was kind of a combination that really got me thinking, is the human body being less kind of hardwired in reflexes and more plastic. I had written an article a long time ago on why a chimpanzee was stronger than a human from a nervous system perspective. It was something with the gray and the white matter, and they could just produce more force really fast, but they had less ability to fine tune. Like a chimp can't play the violin. It's just too much of a fine motor task for it. Anyways, long story short, I was thinking a lot of the training, especially, and I've mentioned this in a lot of my podcasts, so I'm a little redundant, but I do a lot of learning into some of the Jay Schrader mentality, which is a lot of coordination training. It's very specific to turning muscles on and off as quickly as you possibly can. And it's almost like you're trying to eliminate some of those inhibitions and things like that. And then, with maybe a question I could follow up here is, Franz Bosch talks a lot about the reflexes, cross extensor and stumble and these types of things. What's your take on the role of, since reflexes are so plastic, we have a lot of, I guess, humans or potential athletes who could have a really less developed cross extensor reflex than others, and how does that development play a role in athletics?
Okay, well, a couple of things there. First of all, I know Franz pretty well, and we get on well, and we've presented together a couple of times on coordination, because we both, look at the same topic but with different eyes, which is always good. I think that there are reflexes embedded throughout our spinal cord. They underlie everything we do in movement. Some of those reflexes are very short latency, very fast reflexes, happen in a very short time, but they're very dumb in the sense that they don't do anything complex. It's just an on-off switch. Higher up the spine, there's more complex reflexes who are maybe a little more nuanced and work in a slower time frame, or work on a slower time frame. Also embedded in our spine, that's really relevant to running, walking, crawling, any rhythmical, evolutionary embedded activity or gait, are what tend to be called central pattern generators. I say tend to be because there's still some kind of argument about what exactly they are, but basically collections of neural circuitry that regulate rhythmic, evolutionary prioritized movement. And that makes great sense from a evolutionary efficiency perspective. So let's say Joel decides Joel wants to run. In his higher brain, there's a decision, I'm going to run. But your higher brain is really precious real estate. That doesn't want to be taken up with what is a mundane, activating a mundane task. So that'll just hit a lower brain center and say, oh, Joel pressed the button to run. Okay, what speed? Okay, bam, bam, bam. It'll take in sensory information and it will say, okay, let's do this. Then it will hit the spinal cord. It'll hit the central pattern generator and it will basically say, okay, plug and play here, put in your jogging program and run that. And then you take a step and all these postural and stabilization reflexes are kicked in and activated. The more practiced you are as a runner, the more coherent they are, the more well aligned they are, the more dependent they are on each other in terms of if this happens in this reflex, then this happens in this reflex, and it becomes this beautifully mutually orchestrated control system that's just very efficient. You know, it's like Bill Gates isn't emptying the trash cans at the end of the day. Everything is delegated down and you keep the prime decision-making real estate in terms of higher brain centers for doing what they and only they can do. Everything else is farmed out. So from that perspective, and just to try and bring it back to where you were going with your question in relation to, well, you know, what's the practicalities of these? I think coordination training is kind of the last big frontier, or one of the big unexplored frontiers in athletic conditioning for runners, without question, but also for field sports players and, you know, anyone that executes anything on one leg or two legs. And I think Franz Bosch, and I give him a lot of credit for this. If you go back, you know, 2004, 2005, when he first came on the scene outside of, you know, Holland, when he first came into our cultural awareness, coordination training was really not good. It was really rudimentary. It tended to be different coaches, certainly in track and field, had their favorite drills, and that was what happened. There was no real deep understanding of what it was or how critical it was. So I think Franz did a really good job there. Now, what I would say is where we are at the moment, it has kind of turned into a situation where everybody is making up coordination drills. And, you know, you turn on YouTube and there's lots and lots of different things. But I guess it's getting harder and harder to draw the distinction between, is this actually an effective coordination drill or pretty much a circus act? Is this me learning a trick and then being able to do the trick and it looks impressive, but it isn't really carrying over to my real world sporting activity, which is the absolute meat and drink that I want to affect? And I think that's kind of where we are at the moment. There's a lot of confusion in the field. I think there is quite a bit of evidence, but it tends to be buried in esoteric journals of experimental neurology and so on, or experimental brain research, and it isn't clear to us. Now, I guess there's a couple of obvious things. You talked about adaptability. And, and I guess the Glenn Cunningham and Serena Burla examples are, if they do one thing, it's illustrate how adaptable humans can be. Now that level of adaptive plasticity, it's a blessing on one hand, and it's a curse on another. And I think the curse in running contexts, you could illustrate by just discussing the topic of overuse. So again, with overuse injury, you're running, let's say, pretty much the same way for miles and miles. Maybe you're on high mileage, maybe you're a little bit tired, maybe you've had previous injuries. But let's say there's a whole host of factors that constrain how you run. And then unless you take efforts to broaden those constraints and ensure that you can run in an adaptive, flexible way in which you are responsive to all kinds of perturbations and challenges, then ultimately that's the root cause of overuse. It's like, I do the same way until the same way becomes the only way that I can do. And I become so efficient that in my brain, I need less and less cortical real estate to execute this movement. And on a physical level, then I need less and less muscular activation, which sounds like a good thing, until it becomes to the state where you're now becoming deconditioned, and anything that falls outside of that very narrowly constrained stride pattern, coordination pattern, becomes a challenge that you're not now conditioned for. And that's when the wheels start to come off, and that's where the little hot spots start to emerge. Tendon keeps getting pulled in the same way by the same motor units. You can start getting a little bit of a hot spot develops on an articular surface, and the wheels just start to come off. A little bit later, you start feeling pain somewhere. Oh, it's my knee. Well, it is your knee. That's where the pain is, but that's not where the problem is necessarily. The problem is too much of the same thing. And that same plasticity that kind of bestows us with this fantastic adaptability and fantastic ability to learn various skills, that's now become a constraining kind of a rut. And that's the way I kind of think of it. It's when you're young, if you can imagine yourself taking a sled, going to the top of a hill, nobody else has been there, you slide down. Every now and again there's a rock, there's a tree, there's some hardwired reflex, there's some anatomical feature that you have to work around. But your sensory system finds ways to work around all those. The next time you go down that slope, you're slightly biased towards going the same way, and the next time and the next time. From a running perspective, what you want that slope to be, you want a track embedded there. It's greased, it's compacted, it's super fast, but it's not too narrow. It's not too broad, so it's unbeaten, it's greased, but it's not too narrow. You keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and eventually the edges creep in, and now it becomes a rut. And when you're stuck in a rut, that's when you're kind of predisposed to all the overuse syndromes.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by SimpliFaster. Yeah, that's fascinating. I actually kind of covered my next question a little bit in terms of why we get hurt more often than the animals, which, I mean, people will say, it's like, well, animals don't lift weights and we have a lot of forebrain, more outer brain than they do and think about things. But it's like we're probably the only people on this planet that actually run in circles intentionally or do something intentionally sustained, like where animals have a lot more variability wired in.
Well, I guess just to be contrary here, I don't know if we get injured more often because I don't think anyone's done the stats on that. I don't think anyone's passed out the questionnaire to a couple of thousand bison and say, well, who picked up an overuse injury the last time you migrated a couple of 100 miles. So I don't know about that. I guess the other thing is we're strange in the sense that we run a lot, not because we're forced or not because we're being chased, but because, hey, we love to run, or we're training for competition, or I really want to get that marathon on my bucket list, or whatever it is. I presume, an animal is going to say, I want to get there mildly faster than I am, and I'll run. Every now and again, there might be like that 2 minutes of blinding panic when a predator passes. But other than that, I'd say they're pretty economical in how they run. They're probably not as, I don't think they're probably as hung up on training schedules and so on as we are.
Yeah. I think, where our stats come from too, we maybe operate on an N of 1 where the middle-aged, men's softball game and someone runs to first base that pulls their hamstring. It's like, I didn't see my dog do that. I mean, it's probably easy to make decisions and assumptions there. But going back to what you were saying a little bit, and then you said this in your the running article that you had written, and it's something that honestly has been in my mind ever since. So, and you just talked about it a little bit, but that was the widening and narrowing of the nervous system. And so this is like, it's almost been a decade's worth of kind of unpacking this idea. But I was a high jumper in track and field, and I always noticed when I was playing basketball, I could jump very high, but the more I got away from basketball, and just did standard training that was more, I guess you could say, in the rut type movements, that was more narrow work, my jumping would either injury would creep up, or I would start to stagnate. I noticed that trend with a lot of athletes actually, and so I would always try to play games once a week in our training or something that was just completely open. But I wanted to actually unpack that a little bit, like, because you had mentioned cortical real estate in the brain, and you had mentioned the widening and narrowing of the nervous system, and I would just actually, if you could go into that, exactly what's happening there from a brain science level, because I think that's it's something not a lot of people think about, but I think it has so many training implications, not just for injury, but also even performance.
Well, obviously I'm not a brain scientist. I am just a keen student. But there's detail and there's intricacies and there's complications around all of these, but it's pretty well established that you start to learn. Well, okay, first off, every motor unit in your body is connected to your brain by a neuron. By a nerve. And the nerve and the neuron are pretty much the same. So there's a neuron in the motor cortex, there's a nerve that goes down, exit your spinal cord, goes into the muscle and attaches to the motor end plate of a motor unit. You want to turn on that motor unit and that neuron just activates, just fires. Signal goes down the nerve, out your spinal cord, boom. And all the fibers attached to that motor unit contract or try to contract. And that's basically it. Now, the more, as we said at the start, you're an infant, you're pretty much a blank slate. Yeah, of course you have tendencies and so on, but you don't have anything hardwired in there. The more you move, the more you start to plastically change the way the neurons in your motor cortex relate to each other. Simple example, if I am a violinist, and this work has been done with violinists plenty of times, and I start to learn, and I start to, I have a left hand that, let's say, plays the actual note, and then a right hand that holds the bow. So over time, the motor maps, so basically the neurons in your motor cortex that represent the finger, your fingers will become more well defined than the corresponding maps for your hand that holds the bow. Similarly, again, this work has been done, if you get a monkey, you sew two of their fingers together, their motor maps blur. So basically the neural representations of how those entities are separately controlled blurs, and it merges. A few days later, you cut the stitches, the monkey moves his fingers independently, and those maps start to separate again. So if you translate upwards into us, anytime we learn a skill, there is actually, it isn't some amorphous philosophical motor plan or motor program that's mystically formed in your brain. It's actually a hard physical change that happens. Microscopic, yes, or very small at least, yes. But if neuron A and neuron B are intimately involved in executing a skill, then they will start to wire together more effectively and efficiently than if they weren't working together. And hence the kind of the strap line in that research: neurons that wire together, fire together, or fire apart, wire apart, and so on. So basically that's, at least at the level of the motor cortex, that's what happens when you learn a skill. So what happens as we transition through from birth into childhood is the motor maps of representing neurons that we regularly use expands. As we become more and more practiced at that skill, what actually happens is that motor map space contracts. Now, that sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually not. What it is it's necessary efficiency. So it's like, you know what, I can execute this skill perfectly, but I've become so good at it that I can do it with less kind of volume of neurons as I currently have. And obviously, neurons are a really precious commodity. So your brain doesn't want to equip neurons just to execute one type of movement. They say, well, if we don't need that one, let's farm it out to some other movement. So the natural progression is more neurons involved in a movement when you're learning, then you learn it, less neurons involved in activating or controlling that movement. Now, you extend that on where I become super skilled, but I actually start to overdo it, and the efficiency goes a little bit dysfunctional in terms of I keep contracting and contracting my working population until eventually it just doesn't work. Now, you can clearly see this in things like if you've ever come across musicians' cramp, where you get a violinist who's playing for years and all of a sudden they can't play the notes. There's just some type of lock that's just, I know what I should be doing, but I can't do it. And it's just like the maps have become so finely detailed that they just collapse in on top of one another, and you can't execute it. You can't execute something that's been over practiced. Now, I have seen it actually in a runner. And it's amazing, in a distance runner, that they just developed a completely weird, really noticeable quirk out of the blue. Just after high mileage, just quirk, and all of a sudden there's this crazy flick that wasn't there. Now, normally you don't get to see that because someone gets injured before they get to that stage. Just they ping an overuse or something, but yeah, quite bizarre. And that, it obviously happens as we move into extreme old age. It's the same thing. Things just become over practiced, and all of a sudden, the way sometimes you see someone that is old and frail, and the movements have become, even if there's no physical limitation, the flexibility or dexterity or adaptability that they can perform or really practice movement deteriorates, and it becomes nearly a caricature of what it was. And I think that this is all ultimately a phenomenon that you can trace back to plasticity or neuroplasticity.
Yeah, I think two of the most alive-looking, dynamic, older humans I've seen. There's a video of two 60-year-olds from Brazil, 60-something, doing breakdancing, and these guys were just able to do everything, just full of life, and they're just doing these crazy flips and tricks. But I'm like that's variability, that's a fountain of youth right there,
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it is variability, and it's. If you compare it maybe to distance running as an example, now obviously distance running is extremely healthy for a huge amount of reasons, but you need to take care about getting your variability in there, or coordination. Unless coordination is stimulated to improve, there will come a stage when resources are low, be those resources low because of aging, or because you're very tired, or anything like that, where you will start to contract in yourself in terms of your coordination patterns. Something like breakdancing, I mean, like, that's an amazing, there's strength, there's stability, there's flexibility, there's agility, there's power, there's endurance, there's a whole hamper full of good stuff in there.
Yeah, I was on a little kick on that in high school, and actually it really helped my other skills in many regards. That was a really fun experience.
I actually, just to jump in there, a good example is, so you go back maybe 2000, and there was a lot of talk about early specialization and get the kids in young and get them training hard. And the pendulum has totally swung against that now, because the stats are just showing that, you over specialize too early, and there's a lot of injury, and there's a lot of breakdown, and there's a lot of there's an emotional toll, and there's a lot of people just moving away from the sport. So I think that, that's just another manifestation of the same phenomenon. And I think it's not confined to the brain or anything like that, or to sport. It's just, as humans, we're built to, it's all about baby bear's porridge. Too much, too little is not good for us. What we need is, what would you call it? Yeah, some kind of focused variability, and enough variability that we're constantly getting exposure to a wide diversity of challenges.
Oh, yeah, right on. I couldn't agree more. As you were talking to, I had two thoughts in terms of like the expansion and contraction of the brain real estate, and when it gets too contracted. And I know you've done a lot of work with Martin Bingisser, and I was thinking about the Bondarchuk training system and how you have everything is the same, like every exercise is the same, and you keep going through that program until you adapt. And so would that kind of be, do you think that point in adaptation in that training cycle where your performance peaks and then you start to drop, it reflects the brain's real estate maybe changing as well? I'm sure there's so many things going on, but or any skill we could plug into training, really, any exercise, so to speak.
I hadn't thought about it in that context, and I think that would be a really awkward one for me to answer. Not because I don't want to answer it, but there's a lot of kind of curly bits and little cul-de-sacs in what you said there. What I would say in relation to practical training, well, I guess all training is practical, but two things. One, in relation to strength training, I think for too long, strength training has been too constrained. Too much of just get strong. Just get strong if you're weak. If you're already strong, yeah, okay, now we need to find some other ways to challenge you. And I think that, I think strength training has seen a transition from really a very much squat, clean, bench type focus to a focus that is more wide based, more diversity in there. But I think we're at the stage now where sometimes it just seems like diversity for diversity's sake. So we need to kind of get some philosophical perspective on, hang on, how much variety do I need? And then, some handle on what is the right amount of variety for this team or this individual in this season. And then some ways to control that variety, and some ways to track it and monitor it and monitor its effects. And I think that's how we can move forward on the strength perspective. On the coordination training perspective, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is largely untapped territory. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we kicked off, I said that, there's a number of different centers that control coordination. There's your higher brain, there's lower brain centers, cerebellum and so on. There's central pattern generators, these neuronal circuits that embed kind of templates for rhythmical movement. There's really fast and much slower spinal and postural reflexes. So there's a whole, there's a number of centers all the way down the central nervous system that are involved in controlling movement. But we tend to think of movement coordination as controlled really just by the brain. And depending on what or whose philosophy you buy into, your coordination training might be, well, you just do the activity, but you do a wide diversity of the activity. So if you're a football player, you do all kinds of drills, and you play football, you might play small-sided games, and that takes care of that. And you think, okay, yeah, well, you know what, that would certainly take care of a chunk of it, but there's no way it takes care of all of it. So, for example, if I'm left-footed and I'm playing soccer for 15 years, there's going to be a coordination asymmetry in my body. The more that asymmetry grows, you got to ask the question, does that set me up for A, poor performance, or B, higher risk of injury? And I would think all logic would suggest, yeah, probably. Yeah, so how do we correct that? Well, we don't. We kind of tend to ignore it, right? If we look at reflexes, well, okay, we've got slower reflex, we've got postural reflexes. So, for example, I stand on one leg and I feel that I'm starting to topple over, and some reflexes kick in. I don't have to think about it, just boom, 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 kicks in, and I right myself. Okay, so they seem like important, especially in sports where I'm bouncing from one leg to the next. They're going to be important. Would they be knocked out of calibration if I overtrained, or if I did a lot of mileage, or I did too much movement in the same movement pattern, or I got a knock in the football match at the weekend? And you think, yeah, it would go out of whack. Okay, and am I now at a risk unless I restore that and recalibrate it in some way? And my logic would say, actually, yeah, it would be. And I think that's it. For anyone who works a lot with injured athletes, I mean, it's a clear giveaway of prior injuries is that, hey, your stability seems slightly different one side to the next. Now, you can't see it at normal speed, but if we slow it right up, you can see it. Is that something that should be trained? Is it trained on a regular basis? Not really. Another thing that we don't train is, so again, I talked about fast reflexes, slow reflexes. So, for example, if I'm balancing on a single leg and I'm doing something with my free leg, let's say I'm doing a single leg RDL or an arabesque or one of those movements, if you're familiar with them, or just some simple kind of slow side kick. Or I'm standing on an ARX pad or a wobble cushion or something like that. They're all pretty much slow reflexes in terms of my foot is on the ground, I'm perturbing my movement, or my movement has been perturbed, and then some reflexes, a whole series of reflexes are kicking in to restore movement and rebalance me. But how about if my sport is, I'm a basketball player, a volleyball player, and I'm about quick landings and really quick reflexes, so really quick 15 milliseconds type range. How is that training that? And you read the science, and there isn't a lot there, but it looks like, well, actually, that's not training that. It's training something different. So how do we train that? Okay, well, there's a question. Now, I mean, I think there's answers, but I guess what I'm slowly and clumsily getting at is that we think of coordination as one thing, but it's not. Coordination is a number of different things, or a number of different targets you need to hit to have a wholly coherent coordination training system. And, I haven't seen that. I've worked with a lot of really good track and field coaches who are really good at this stuff, but I haven't seen a coordination training system that covers the full spectrum. A lot of work with Franz, great respect for him, but again, I don't see that full spectrum there. And I think that that's probably the next step, is us developing a more coherent and wide-ranging coordination training system.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by SimpliFaster. So, John, based off that, you talk about full spectrum of the coordination package. So what, in a nutshell, what practically are coordinative means that we should be having in an athlete's performance program for running or any sports skill? Like I said, that last little bit made it wide, but based off what you were talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a tough question, but I'll give it my best shot in terms of where my thinking is at the moment. There's one really important thing that I didn't mention yet. So it's coming in pretty late, but I think it's incredibly important, and that is there is no accurate athletic movement without really well calibrated interpretation of sensory information. So maybe I'll just say that again. Every movement you do is totally dependent. How you execute is totally dependent on how your central nervous system interprets sensory feedback. And I think we all kind of know that intellectually, but we never talk about it in practice. I mean, I've never heard a coach ask about how do we train interpretation of sensation or sensory interpretation. But yet it's totally half of the battle, really. I mean, if you think about it, for me to move, I send a signal, I send a feed-forward activation signal to my muscle. But to know where I am in time and space and how big or small or fast or slow that signal needs to be, I need accurate interpretation of where I am in space and time. So I need to accurately interpret feedback sensory information. And I guess they're irrevocably entwined. As soon as I send an activation signal, it changes sensory information. As soon as I receive sensory information, it changes activation signal. And that's the way we work. It's not a send a signal, wait for sensory information. It's like mutually entwined, happening in real time. I send a signal, feedback changes. I change the signal according to that feedback changes some more. And that's the loop. And it's even a mistake for me to say things like feedback and feed forward. It's just all one loop. It's, the technical term is it's a sensory motor loop. And that, when you think about that, it kind of puts a little bit of an interesting spin on how we execute coordination training. One thing is, if we want to drive plastic change, then that's all dependent on feedback information. Essentially, it's how you treat feedback information and how pertinent and important that feedback information is to ongoing movement success. That will regulate whether or not the resources necessary to drive plastic change will be allocated to that aspect of the movement or not. When you're a kid, it's easy to drive plastic change. Everything does it because it's all new. When you're an adult, i.e. a mature athlete, it's not so easy because resources are scarce and precious up there. So what seems to regulate it is how your brain prioritizes the movement. Okay, so what they would say is you are paying attention to it, but it's not attention is I'm listening intently. It's that your lower brain centers are focused on the feedback. So, for example, I'll give you a practical example. If you're standing on one leg doing some type of arabesque type movement on an AirX pad, and you're not used to doing it, your brain will kind of go offline. If I ask you what you're thinking about, you'll go, I'm not really sure. And that's just you getting out of the way. And what's happening is neural resources are just focusing on sensory information, ping, 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 react, react, react. And it's a good guide to whether or not your coordination training is working. Can someone execute it without concentrating? If they can, you need to go up a level. Alternatively, if someone is failing too often, you need to go down a level, but it's a constantly moving target. The figure they'll throw out in the neuroscience literature is roughly 75% of the time you succeed but about a quarter of the time you fail the specific task.
John, I really like that. You talking about the 75%, 25% and the conscious awareness really makes me think of people draw that line between the intersection of rehabilitation and strength training as like the performance zone, right? I've seen that Venn diagram. I think it's really interesting in it. What you were just saying really makes me think about that. And I know we talk about coordination training a lot these days, and for good reason. And so in terms of like a checklist, like things, I'm programming exercises in the system, and I'm trying to kind of check off boxes and say, okay, I want these boxes to be checked, so I know this athlete is going to improve their coordination specific to the skill they're trying to develop. What are some things that we could check off?
Okay, well, that's a $6 million question. And I think that, and having kind of been around elite training environments for quite a while now, I think that in general we do it okay, but I think there are a number of, I think thought is evolving so quickly that I can't point at any previous work that absolutely nailed it, including my own work. I just don't think we've had the background. So what we do is we get people that buy into one school of thought. It has to be very specific, it has to be fast, or we get others who think, well, no, it has to be slow and controlled. So I kind of have it broken down in my head for if I'm looking at coordination training, a really effective coordination training program, then I think there are elements to it that are slow, controlled, demand focused attention, allow you time to process sensory information and make subtle adjustments to maintain stability or direction of travel, or whatever may be appropriate for the movement. So an example of a movement like that might be, I'm on an AirX pad, I'm in my bare feet, the coach has given me some type of stability challenge, and it may be that I'm going to do some type of slow controlled side kick with my free leg while my standing leg just stabilizes. And what happens there all the time, obviously, is that stabilization reflexes are constantly flicking on and off. Lower level centers responsible for coordinating movement are being pinged all the time by sensory information at the level of the spinal cord, and they're having to make quick adjustments. At the same time, higher up the chain, motor cortex is kind of thinking, okay, I need to adjust my posture slightly, I need to do this slightly, I need to shift my balance slightly. So there's a lot of dimensions of coordination that are getting hit there. Now, they're not things they're things that commonly we tend to neglect, and we don't do enough of that training. Now, there may be arguments against it. Well, if somebody is fit and healthy, they don't need it. Well, maybe, but and again, we don't have hard science on this, but certainly the feedback I've got from senior elite athletes is that type of stuff seems to help quite a number of them. Like every type of training, it won't tick the box for everyone, but I think especially for people who've had a number of years of service in a sport, who've accumulated injuries, who've had their overuse syndromes, who've taken knocks and bangs, that type of recalibration work, I would suggest, is very valuable. And it's easy stuff. It's low energy. It can be relatively low time cost. It doesn't generate a lot of fatigue. What it really takes is a little bit of design. And by design, I mean there has to be an element of challenge. And I already mentioned the kind of 75% as a broad target mark. I mean, if I'm doing a rep and it's maybe it involves a slow step up to a box, and maybe on the other side to the leg I'm stepping on, I have to, for example, let's say do a dumbbell press. So something that's setting up kind of cross tension across my torso. 75%. Now that doesn't mean you fall down. It just means you kind of lose balance and you have to break your rhythm to restabilize. Those type of things I think are really useful. So let's just say we have one category of coordination exercise that might be called, slow controlled. And that's the watchword. They're the watchword, slow and controlled. Now it could be a slow controlled walking drill, a reverse walking drill. It could be a step up onto a box, for example, or a step down, but slow, controlled, time to process sensory information, very, very precise coach instructions. You need to pay attention to your posture, chest stays big, whatever it might be, but the coach is guiding the athlete's attention around their body by their instructions. You need to stiffen up in your ankle when you land in that box, blah, blah, blah. You need to control your knee movement, all those type of things. So let's say the slow controlled, it could be static, standing on an instability pad. It could be a slow walking drill. It could be a step up drill or a step down drill, as I said. So anyway, I've rabbited on about that enough. So another category then would be more dynamic drills, but where the outcome and the direction of travel are planned. So for example, I am doing a dynamic step up, and maybe I'm starting with, if you can imagine, just as an example, I have a 4 or 6 inch box in front of me. Then there's a much higher box in front of that box. So I'm starting with my strike leg poised 4 or 5 inches over the small box. I'm balanced there like that. I'm going to strike as hard as I can into the box, but without winding up that leg. In other words, without lifting up that leg and slamming it down. It's just a really quick activation, and I'm onto the box with sufficient force to propel me up into the high box, as an example. Now, there's multiple variations you could do here. If the athlete is adequate at the basic movement, I might put a band around their chest attached to a squat rack, or it could be a dowel overhead with a 2.5 or 5 kilo weight hanging off one side, or we can add any layer of challenge on there depending on the athlete's ability. But the key thing is the athlete thinks, okay, I need to think about, coach told me to think about posture. Okay, chest stays big, shoulders back, head forward, eyes front. The coach wants me to work my ankle stiffness. So when I hit the box, I'm going to hit it like with a 1/2 foot contact. So just my front half of my foot is on, but I can't let my heel drop, for example. And then I propel myself up, and I land. So something like that. And again, what the coach is doing is guiding attention around the athlete's body, making the athlete focus and setting a level of difficulty that if the athlete doesn't pay attention to both the coach's instruction and what they're doing, then they don't have a successful outcome and they don't learn.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, and now you can do that. You can do that in, as I said, step up, step down. You can use instability pads. There isn't really any rules we have other than we want it to be relevant to the athlete's sport. So if you're a swimmer and you're doing a dynamic step up, maybe that's not relevant. But if you're a field sports player or a runner, or a jumper, then it's going to be very relevant. And then I think the other thing that you would build into those dynamic drills those dynamic movement challenges are things like hop and holds. So I come down from a box and I stick my landing. Or I come down from a box, I land on an instability pad and I stick my landing. Or I do, 3 or 4 micro hurdle hops and then I turn and stick. But again, the objective is, okay, we want a pre-planned movement. We want, as coaches, we want to specify, we want to guide the athlete's attention around their body by saying, okay, you need to think about, we need a good stick here. Or we give them, there's an instability pad that they land on, so there's a little bit of dynamic perturbation there. And it's really just playing about with the constraints in an appropriate way to set the level of challenge for the athlete, that I always have to pay close attention to what I'm doing to successfully complete the task the coach has set. So far we have two broad categories. We have, okay, let's slow, purposeful, and then we have, okay, this is more dynamic, but it's a relatively closed type of skill. I mean, it's not open decision making. It's, this is what I do. The third category, I think, then would be where it's not pre-planned. Now, I think that there's lots of, in every sport has drills that challenge athletes in a non-pre-planned way, be it, you know, I receive a pass and I have to pass to whatever player is available, or the coach points here and I have to pass there. So we don't need to talk about those, but you know, those type of dynamic change of direction, acceleration, deceleration drills are obviously fundamental towards the back end of rehab processes and return to play processes and in general conditioning. But we all know and love those, and every sport has its fair share of drills that people commonly use. The one thing that is very underused and very under investigated, I'm only aware of a couple of studies, and they've been done by, there's a German therapist who works in Malaysia, works a lot. Malaysians, I don't know if you know this, but they're really successful in a couple of sports. Squash, for example, badminton, you know, they're pretty awesome in those type of events. And one of the things that he studied is the value of unpredictable perturbations. Now, just as a qualifier, this has mostly been in people returning from injury, but they've got pretty dramatic results. So, for example, a simple drill might look like, I'm going to step off a box. And it's not a high box, maybe a 20 centimeter box, you know, it's not very high. And I'm just going to stick the landing. So it's an easy task. And just as I'm stepping off, I get a nudge. Simple as that. I just get a nudge. I get a push. I have a partner behind me and they give me a little push. So that is an unexpected perturbation. I don't hit the ground as I planned. And all these really short loop, really primitive reflexes have to kick in. Boom, boom, boom. And then I stabilize. Another one might be, I'm going for a basketball layup and I get nudged again. So again, my landing is thrown off and I have to adjust. And again, the short loop reflexes have to kick in really quickly and correctly. And then the longer loop reflexes kick in and then my conscious control kicks in. Now, that sounds like really simple stuff, but the amazing thing has been, even with international level athletes, the level of improvement that they've gotten in things like short-term speed, jump ability, basic metrics, of coherent, powerful athletic movement. Now, it's hard to scale those type of drills up. It's easy if you've one priority athlete and you're doing one-on-ones with them. But how do you scale those type of exercises up to squads, especially if you're an S&C in a university and you're working with a number of squads and it's rigidly timetabled and there's large numbers, what can you do? And I would think that there is, again, there's exercise design ways around that. So it may be that we're doing some type of jumps, hop and holds, or repeat jumps where it's over an obstacle onto a instability pad or something like that. Obviously, it needs to be regulated for safety. It needs to be regulated for challenge. But it's just to say to people, because this message isn't out there, that there's a logical, rational explanation why those type of movements would be really important. Every time you hit the ground, it's those really rudimentary short loop reflexes that kick in first. If they don't kick in exactly the right time, exactly the right intensity, then movement smoothness is kicked off a little bit. And this is all at the micro level, stuff you can't see, but stuff that's going on all the time. And what What you want, like what the perfectly coordinated athlete has, is have these really quick reflexes kicking in, and then these longer loop reflexes kick in, and then there's all these neural centers in the spine that kick in their control, and then at the top your brain is sitting there having very little to do. It's just saying go left, go right, and then your spinal cord is taking care of everything else. When it's working effectively, all those individual compartments collaborate seamlessly, but you're very fatigued, you've taken a couple of knocks, you have a number of historical injuries, and the synchronization between those different departments, if you like, starts to go off a little bit, and movement becomes a little less smooth, a little more clunky. You're hitting the ground a little harder, you're a little less efficient, your knee gets a bit more grumbly. All those kind of things start to happen. So in a very, I guess, I don't say rudimentary, but obviously each of these things you can go deeper and deeper into each of these elements, but as a broad overview, and for me as a practitioner who I guess 20 years really working with athletes who are either actively injured or recovered from injury or history of long injury, they're the components that I think of when I'm introducing a program, not necessarily a rehab program, but how can I make this player more efficient on the pitch or on the track? What can we do? And it's not like you always have elements of box 1, box 2, box 3. It's like, well, okay, what's the right blend for this specific athlete? Now, just to say, in a lot of contexts I've worked in, you have the luxury of working with one athlete for an extended period of time. And I know a lot of your listeners will work with large squads. But again, my perspective is if you can introduce any of these elements in, even in subtle ways, none of them take an awful lot of time. And that's the marvelous thing about them. You can get good results pretty quickly. It just takes a little bit of planning and a little bit of design. And these things can go in the start, in the middle, at the end of sessions. They can be dotted around the training week, tagged onto the back of warm-ups. I think they can be implemented really easily. They don't have to be big blocks of training. They don't add a lot of fatigue. But, all the evidence and it points to these are likely to work. I would say that all my experience points to that as well, but experience is always going to be biased, and there's no reason why people should believe my experience. But at least what I'm suggesting is there's a rational line of thought, and people can feel free to knock it as they see fit.
Yeah, I think every time we get into instability, right, there's always the people who are going to knock that and be like, oh, it doesn't get you as strong like the typical train. I found I've gotten into the Marv Marinovich Probot X stuff, which it was really the whole system revolved a lot around the balance balls and balance discs and dynamic stabilization. And he did a little bit of maximal force work on like Bearcat, St. Kaiser type movements, but talking to athletes who have gone through that system, they loved it. Like they just felt really good. And even myself doing that type of work for a few months, I remember back when I was like 22, I noticed a significant change even in my vertical jump, even though it wasn't like I wasn't lifting the heaviest weights, but it was just something I felt like my body needed and was able to overcome a new challenge. And so that stuck with me.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think that, we have, or what we should have, I think, as coaches is this big box of training tools. And it's just being aware that yes, some of the traditional tools are great, and no one is saying move away from good heavy strength training or anything like that. But what you are saying is, hey, there's other dimensions of training that can meaningfully contribute to your movement proficiency. It's not just about let's get strong, and I can be as strong, you can make me as strong as you want, but if I have one knee where the control is loose, and just making that leg stronger isn't remedying that, then what are you going to do? Because if you're just a let's get strong, squat big guy, you're not going to fix that for me. So it's just, yeah, let's put the big rocks in place, but let's fill in the gaps as well. And a lot of the time, filling in the gaps can be really easy, really time efficient. It just takes a little bit of planning, a little bit of design from the coach, and then these small little inserts can be infiltrated in the training week in a way that's really productive for the athlete without interfering with, as I said, the big rocks of their training.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, the last thing I'll ask and mention, and I did find this really interesting, is you're talking about the perturbations and the reflexes. And every time I watch any sporting movement, to be honest, but specifically some things like javelin throw, where the timing is just so, it's just so crazy to watch. Like when the plant leg comes down and then the force transmits through the body, and it really just reminds me how in any sport timing is just so critical. And listening to you talk about the feedback loops is really interesting. And so, but that got me thinking of a few things. One, just like contact sports, almost, it's like basketball. I think that could even be built into the sport, like because you're constantly getting it as a function of people running into you or having to jump after getting bumped around or those types of ideas. And I'm always looking at why. I always go back to, I always use myself as an example. It's where at least my ideas start, or even athletes I've seen working with high jumpers and things like that, how basketball has such a tremendous impact. And I think there's so many things in that game that are built in to why we see good results in that realm and arena.
Well, the only thing I'd say with the basketball is when you're playing a game and let's say you jump and you get bashed in the air, that's a kind of a pass-fail test. You either stick the landing or you come down and you get injured or you lose balance. Mm-hmm. Whereas in training, what you can do is you can moderate the challenge to the extent that this is a moderate challenge to this person. It is perfectly safe. And next week, we're going to push it forward a little bit. Whereas under game conditions, you can't do that. It's pass-fail. You know, you might get injured. Whereas in training, and that's what training is all about, how can I make you more resilient? Okay, I can make you more resilient by drip feeding you this challenge on a regular basis. So when it comes to the big perturbation in the biggest match of your life, you can cope with it efficiently and robustly.
Yeah, you have that fine-tuned control. I wanted to ask you too. So with given the perturbation idea, and just talking about the reflexes and coordination of all things, and I wanted to get your take on how giving an internal cue impacts things. Like, can it be useful still? We hear a lot of internal versus external cues, and given the timing of the body and the reflexes, and everything that goes into producing movement, what does internal cueing do? Like, can it be useful? How do we approach something like telling an athlete, okay, you're gonna throw, and now I want you to lead with your elbow, or anything like any sort of sport cue that you're trying to give to somebody?
Well, I guess the problem with this argument, like so many other arguments, is that it tends to be down an either or type choice. You know, it's all external cueing, but certainly if you want to enhance an athlete's awareness of, you know, when you do this movement, this is what's happening, then what I would do is I would slow it up and I would guide the athlete's attention to how they're feeling. Now this applies definitely for me at least, to people coming back from injury or with significant prior injury. One of the things that happens with injury is you lose the ability to properly interpret the sensory information coming from that previously injured tissue. So you need to re-educate that. So I can think of lots and lots of examples where certainly in the gym or in slow movement stuff on the track that I would guide the athlete's attention internally. Obviously, if it's a competitive environment, if it's a practice game environment, if it's a drill that is replicating or needs decision making at a higher level, then you would be telling the athlete to focus externally. But I think for me, it's using internal cues to recalibrate the kind of brain spinal cord with the previously injured tissue or damaged tissue. And for that, internal cueing, I think, is really important, if not essential, in isolated movements. You go into more complex sport-specific movements, and then you don't. You focus on the outcome.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I agree with you. I do think it's definitely as a spectrum, not just either this
Sure.
is complete. It's always in context, and yeah, it's a great answer. Thank you for that. And yeah, John, I was just such a good talk today. I really learned a lot, and I really it makes me think of all the things too that people, well, a lot of things that people readily will dismiss. Like um, being all on the strength side of the spectrum or all on another side. And I think it's in the middle where we just really find that gold in the training zone that's going to make an athlete better or bring an athlete back from injury faster. So it was really wonderful talking to you today.
Thank you, Joel. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's another show in the books, and this one was awesome. I learned a ton, and I hope you did as well. And I even after in the training sessions after this episode, I was really just thinking of those coordinative boxes and putting that together with some things I've learned from the Postural Restoration Institute and position. And it can go anywhere from the weight room to the finest of skills acquired in sport. So super cool episode. John's the man, and really enjoyed putting this one together. Before you go, check out our sponsor, SimpliFaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. They have Freelap, GymAware, K-Box. They have ElectroStim, EMG shorts, and pretty much the best or the best of in each tech category in sports performance. So be sure to visit them. Also, if you enjoyed the show, don't hesitate. Leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your listening platform of choice. And we will see you guys next week.